This gentle giant's reaction will restore your faith in unconditional love. In this story, what a 400-pound bear did changed a family's life forever. 3 months earlier, Brutus was just another unwanted wild animal at a remote wildlife rescue facility in the outskirts of Juneau, Alaska. 400 pounds of muscle and strength, with deep scars across his shoulders that hinted at years of struggle, he was the kind of animal most people avoided. The staff whispered about his history, how he'd been kept in a cramped cage by people who didn't understand him, how he'd learned to flinch at sudden movements and tense at raised voices. Some thought he was simply too dangerous to ever be part of a normal family environment. No one believed he could change. But fate had a different plan. One crisp autumn morning, 2 brothers, Daniel and Chris Hart, arrived at the rescue looking for an animal to give a second chance to. Daniel's young son, Mason, only 8 months old, came along bundled in a thick blue coat. When they reached Brutus's enclosure, Daniel was about to keep walking, assuming the massive bear would be too unpredictable, when Mason suddenly stretched out his tiny fingers toward the bars. Brutus, instead of backing away, lowered his great head slowly until his broad, scarred muzzle was within reach. Back home in their log cabin on the edge of a forest, Brutus began a cautious adjustment. For the first few weeks, he kept a respectful distance from Mason. Every morning, Daniel would set Mason in his playpen near the large glass doors that opened to the yard, and Brutus would position himself exactly 6 steps away, close enough to see every movement, far enough to avoid any accidental harm. Chris would watch from the kitchen, noting how Brutus's eyes never strayed far from the boy. The first sign of trust came one quiet Tuesday morning. Mason had dropped his favorite wooden block just out of reach and was stretching toward it, making those soft baby sounds that clearly meant he wanted help. Brutus moved one massive paw forward, then another, lowering his head slowly until his lips gently gripped the block. Without so much as a scratch on the wood, he placed it in front of Mason, then backed away to his usual spot. Daniel, who had been sipping coffee at the table, froze mid-sip. "Did he actually just do that?" he asked in disbelief. Chris only nodded, eyes wide. From that day on, Brutus's interactions with Mason grew more deliberate and protective, as though the bear had decided, without question, that the little boy was his responsibility. Every movement he made around Mason seemed measured, careful, as if he understood just how fragile the child was compared to his own strength. If Mason whimpered in his crib, Brutus would appear almost instantly, lumbering to the doorway with the steady, unhurried gait of a watchman making his rounds. He'd lower his head, peering inside with those dark, unblinking eyes, and make deep, low grunts, tones so soft and resonant it was hard to reconcile them with the sheer size of the animal. The sounds carried through the room like warm vibrations, often calming Mason before either Daniel or Chris could reach him. Sometimes, Brutus wouldn't just stay in the doorway. He'd step forward, placing himself where Mason could see him through the crib rails. The boy's cries would shift into little hiccups, his hands reaching out as if he could touch the familiar fur. Brutus would remain there until Mason's breathing slowed, a silent promise that he was not alone. On colder nights, when the wind rattled the shutters, Brutus would settle just outside the nursery door, his body forming a living barricade against the world beyond. If visitors came to the cabin, Brutus's demeanor would change instantly. He would plant himself between them and the baby with a quiet authority, his massive frame blocking any direct approach. There was no growling, no display of teeth, just an unmistakable sense of ownership over the space and the small life within it. His eyes would follow every movement, his ears flicking toward the faintest sound, making it clear that he missed nothing. Even without aggression, his sheer size and steady, unyielding posture were enough to send a silent message that no one would cross that invisible line without his consent. His presence alone was enough to keep strangers cautious. Weeks turned into months, and the bond deepened. Brutus started spending his mornings beside Mason's high chair. He would lie on the floor with his massive head resting on his paws, watching each spoonful of food and every giggle. Mason, in turn, began reaching down to pat the top of Brutus's head, his tiny fingers disappearing into the thick fur. Daniel and Chris found themselves marveling at how the bear, this massive, scarred survivor, was able to handle the fragile child as if he were the most delicate thing in the world. By the time Mason was 10 months old, he had started pulling himself up on the coffee table, his little legs wobbly but determined. Brutus seemed to sense something important was coming. His patience grew, his movements around Mason slower and even more calculated. Neighbors who had once kept their distance when they saw the Hart brothers walking with Brutus now stopped to watch, whispering about the gentle giant's devotion to the boy. The day everything changed began like any other. Daniel and Chris were in the kitchen preparing lunch, while Mason stood at the coffee table in the living room, babbling happily to himself. Then came a sudden, sharp cry. It was the kind of sound that froze blood. The brothers barely had time to react before they heard the thud of something heavy hitting the floor. Brutus moved first. In an instant, he was across the room, his massive body blurring with speed. When he reached Mason, the boy was falling backward, his head dangerously close to the sharp stone edge of the fireplace. Without hesitation, Brutus slid his huge frame between the child and the stone. The full impact landed on him, his thick fur and muscle absorbing the blow. Mason's head landed safely against Brutus's side instead of the lethal corner. Daniel and Chris rushed in to find the bear curled protectively around the boy, his massive body forming a living wall between Mason and anything that might harm him. One enormous paw rested lightly over the child's legs, the size difference between them almost unreal, Mason's small frame disappearing beneath that gentle weight. Brutus's deep, steady eyes were fixed on the boy's face, watching every flicker of expression as though nothing else in the world existed. Warm breath rose and fell in slow waves, ruffling Mason's hair with each exhale. The boy's sobs, sharp and uneven just moments before, softened into tiny hiccups that seemed to echo in the quiet room. His tear-streaked face pressed closer to the thick fur, one hand fumbling upward until his fingers found an anchor there. Chris's first instinct was to move forward, but Daniel placed a steadying hand on his arm. There was no need to intervene. What they were seeing wasn't danger. It was protection, fierce and absolute. Mason's grip tightened, and Brutus responded with a low, almost imperceptible rumble, the kind that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and settle in the chest. It wasn't a warning. It was reassurance. The tension in the room eased, replaced by something heavier but infinitely warmer. Trust. That night, the shift in Brutus was unmistakable. His usual caution around Mason's sleeping space was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence, as though the events of the day had sealed a bond that could not be undone. The nursery was dim, the faint glow of the nightlight spilling over soft blankets and the faint curve of Mason's cheek. Brutus's shadow filled the doorway for a moment before he stepped inside, his paws silent on the carpet. He glanced at Daniel, pausing as if to ask permission without a sound. Daniel met his gaze, and with the faintest of nods, gave it. Brutus moved closer, lowering his head slowly until the broad curve of his muzzle hovered just above the edge of the crib. Mason stirred faintly but did not wake. The bear's massive head came to rest beside the boy's tiny outstretched hand. In his sleep, Mason's fingers instinctively curled, weaving into the thick fur, clutching it with the kind of trust that asks for nothing and expects everything. He didn't let go, holding on as though it was the safest place in the world. The next morning, something incredible happened. Mason, still in his pajamas with tiny bears printed across the fabric, crawled across the living room floor toward the back door, where Brutus lay stretched out in a patch of sunlight. The big bear lifted his head, eyes following the boy's determined little crawl, and then shifted his weight just enough to let Mason get close. Without hesitation, Mason planted his small hands into the thick fur of Brutus's back and began to pull himself upright. His little legs trembled like saplings in the wind, his lips pressed together in deep concentration. Brutus didn't move, not even to flick an ear. He seemed to understand that this was something important, something that required absolute stillness. Mason's knees straightened, his tiny fingers curling into Brutus's fur, and for the first time since his injury, he stood fully on his own. His face broke into a wide grin, the kind that made his eyes nearly disappear, and he let out a giggle that made Brutus's ear twitch. Then, slowly, so slowly, Mason shifted one foot forward. Brutus didn't so much as breathe too deeply, holding himself like a living, breathing piece of furniture. Mason wobbled but found his balance, then moved the other foot, his grip tightening in Brutus's fur for security. Step after shaky step, he crossed the grass, his tiny socks brushing against fallen leaves, Brutus inching forward at just the right pace to keep him steady. From that day forward, their morning walks became a ritual. No matter the weather, whether the morning light spilled gold through the trees or the ground was damp with dew, Brutus would rise from his spot by the porch as soon as Mason toddled over. The boy's hands would bury into that thick fur, and together they would set off, slow and steady, circling the yard like it was their shared kingdom. Sometimes Mason would talk to Brutus as they moved, telling him about the birds he saw or the dream he had the night before. And though Brutus couldn't answer, he would rumble low in his chest, a sound so soft it felt like a private response meant for Mason alone. Daniel and Chris would often stop whatever they were doing just to watch from the porch. They'd lean against the railing, coffee mugs warm in their hands, the morning air crisp around them, and share glances that said more than words could. It wasn't just cute, it was profound. They knew they were seeing something few people ever got to witness. Two souls, wildly different in form and history, somehow understanding each other completely. Sometimes Mason would stumble, his little legs giving way without warning, and Brutus would instantly adjust, lowering his massive frame so the boy could catch himself. Other times, Mason would get distracted by a passing butterfly or the crunch of leaves, tugging Brutus to a halt without warning, and the bear would simply stop, patient as ever. Their pace was never hurried. It didn't need to be. Each walk was less about reaching a destination and more about moving together, trusting each other in every step. The scars on Brutus's shoulders remained, pale lines against the darker fur, but to Mason they were just another part of his friend. Marks he sometimes traced absent-mindedly with his little fingers as they walked. To Daniel and Chris, those scars told a story they could never erase, but over time, they stopped being reminders of cruelty. Instead, they became proof of survival, of resilience, of the life Brutus had built here in the safety of their home. And though Brutus had been rescued from a life no one would have wished for, it was clear to everyone who saw them that he had rescued Mason in his own way, just as much as the boy had rescued him.